And Joan, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joan Kerr. I haven't met most of you, so Glenn is away on civic duties today. So he asked me to sit in, and because I've actually worked with Steve, I am going to say he's an exciting speaker because I am speaking from experience. Steve and I both co-hosted a session in Iceland a few years ago. And it was the last session of an intense 2-day intersessional at ICANN, and everyone were tired, and all we heard from ICANN staff was good luck. And on our session, everyone participated, and they were really revived and rejuvenated. And Steve did an outstanding job, I would say. So that's my experience with Steve. So he will be speaking to you today about the importance of internet actors, giving us some insights into organizations that have remit in ICANN's for laws, politics, norms, and regulations. So welcome, Steve. And if you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself, and we will monitor the questions for you as you go along. So take it away.
Hey, thank you, Joan. Also, thanks to Glenn McKnight and to Alfredo for hosting the Virtual School of Internet Governance and for inviting me to participate on the panel you selected, which was actors. So what I will do today is do my best to share a perspective on how the audience here for VSIG can help to determine its interests so that it can decide where to exert influence, where to work to become a community member in order to influence the outcomes that serve your interests within the internet governance community. As Joan said, my name is Steve DelBianco. I'm currently the president of NetChoice. That's one of the leading trade associations in the United States for the tech industry. And our members are all listed on our website, but it's the companies you use every day. It's Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, and Google, and eBay, and Pinterest, and a long list of companies who are just trying to use the internet as a place for free enterprise and for free expression. And that's my mission. I work extensively in the US Capitol, in the US states, occasionally in international capitals, but also extensively at ICANN and at the Internet Governance Forum run by the United Nations. We'll cover both those topics later today. Prior to this experience, I'm an engineer and programmer. I had built my own software company and sold it in the late 1990s. That gave me the chance to do something completely different with my life. And that's when I started a trade association called NetChoice. So I'll kick things off with the first slide. And again, as Alfredo indicated, if you put questions in the chat, I'll do my best to keep track of them. Joan and Alfredo, if I miss a question, please bring it up in the audio and I'll pay attention to it at that point. So the first thing I was supposed to do was to talk to you about actors and the definition of actors. Everybody knows the first definition. And if any of you fit that first definition, well, congratulations. That's an exciting profession. This is the more mundane, pedestrian second definition, where all of us are participants in an action or a process. That is almost without choosing, but the choice we make is how active we want to be in asserting that role, that actor's role. Why would we want to be an active participant? Because we may want to influence the outcomes, the policies, the enforcement, and the development and innovation that occurs online and in internet governance circles. Now, you can have multiple roles as an actor. Now, personally, I've played several roles. I was a software entrepreneur, a tech investor and advisor. I'm an advocate now and a lobbyist for the Trade Association of NetChoice and policy chair of the business constituency of ICANN for the last decade. All of these roles can be in parallel, and each of you should consider multiple roles to suit your interests and degree of desire to have an influence. So start in this regard by figuring out what interests you the most, because that will determine how much effort you're going to put in to having an influence on outcomes. This is the sort of situation today with respect to interest and influence, and you should not assume that your interests alone are going to impart the ability to have influence. It takes work, a little bit of luck, and persistence and patience to actually nudge the Titanic a few degrees to the right or the left in terms of influencing policy. Later on, we'll talk about the way evolving influence and interests are occurring today on internet governance as a result of emerging issues, emerging threats and opportunities. So businesses, for instance, in the upper left-hand corner, they showed very early interest in internet governance in the internet, and they exercised that interest by investing billions of dollars in generating most of the internet commerce and the internet content that we use today. And so therefore, they have had, historically, the most influence over what happens online. Think of the services you use: online search, the mapping that you use, video services, communication services, social media, and the content moderation on communities on social media, advertising services that often pay for most of what we see online to be free, and of course, exercise of the privacy policies. So when it comes to influence over internet governance, I would rate business in general, globally, as the highest degree of influence over what has happened so far. Now, governments, over to the right there, are even more interested, I think, in internet governance. That's why they're to the right of business. They're more interested than business because the internet has proven to be incredibly important. And anything that important, well, it just has to be run by governments. That's the way they look at things. So many governments, in addition, they fear how internet communications and collaboration, social media, for instance, can really threaten the powers of the government over its people. So for sure, there's a fear factor there. But governments also want to use the internet to help to improve the lives of their people. And at least as far as governments go, they've been slow so far to influence what's been happening online. They've been playing catch up to the business innovators for the most part, the business and technical innovators. Now, that's not a problem for me because I can't imagine being satisfied with an internet where innovation moves at the speed of government. On the other hand, I will explain later on that a handful of emerging issues and threats are raising even higher the level of influence and interest that governments have on internet governance. They are awake to the opportunities of internet governance, for sure. Now, civil society, which I would say broadly includes universities, technical groups, foundations, advocates, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, they have lots of interest in internet governance, although historically have had less influence than either the business or the governments. So that's why they're positioned lower on the y-axis or the level of influence. I think that is growing, though. That civil society is learning to acquire its voice, and they're actually using the tools that businesses have created for them, tools for social media, video tools, sharing content, collaborating, communicating, building communities online. Civil society is becoming more successful than ever at nudging businesses and governments toward its agenda of priorities. And I think that is emerging to grow in the future. Now, finally, in the lower right-hand corner is the notion of users, which we'll say are consumers, the consumers of internet content, but also those of us that are users who are producing our own content by hosting what? Hosting a website, hosting an online store, building a page on Facebook, doing a lot of tweeting or putting videos on YouTube. In other words, most of us are not only users as a consumer of internet content and commerce, but many of us produce content. But where is our level of influence? It's rather low. We can certainly have complete control over the content we see. We can decide not to use a particular application if we don't like the way it's working, and we don't like the content moderation policies or privacy policies. We have agency, in other words, to influence what it is we do online. That may not affect the way the rest of the world sees that application, and we may only be controlling it for ourselves, but at least we have agency. And on the producer side, we can lead by example, by articulating policies and communicating in a way that we believe conveys the values and interests that are important to us. But we can also be actors in internet governance, which brings us to the next slide.
Steve, we've got a couple of questions for you for this slide. Sorry, Alfredo, I interrupted.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Joan.
So Alfredo, obviously, I am suggesting that today, thus far, in our early history of the internet, business has had the greatest influence so far on internet governance policies, because for the most part, businesses would lead with innovations, and it would be up to civil society and governments to catch up and decide whether they wanted to shape or modify what policies the businesses were advancing. So if a business like Google Search is advancing search algorithms that are based on PageRank, that was a influential decision over the way that search works online. It wasn't something where Google went out and asked permission of a government or a technical body as how they were going to run their search results. And they innovate constantly. When business models came up that were funded by, say, interest-based advertising in order to make services free, when platforms came out for peer-to-peer sharing of labor, assets, and goods, these are innovations. And in that regard, the greatest influence over the policies we experience on the internet today has been driven by business.
So Steve, as a follow-up comment to that or question, hasn't that been sort of turned around with geopolitics and having governments have more influence over how organizations or companies can do business in the internet ecosystem?
Yes, and thanks, Alfredo. 2 slides from now, I'll discuss the evolving influence and interest. And all of these bodies on the screen have arrows indicating where I believe things are moving. So this is a captured picture of where we are today, but I believe it is moving. And business is not gaining, business is losing at the expense of civil society and governments. Bill Juris asked a question about who is the most influential actor. Are they those who run the top level domains like .com and .org? Bill, with all respect, I couldn't disagree more. The company running .com happens to be a company called VeriSign. It's one of NetChoice's members, but VeriSign has nothing to do with the policies that Facebook.com, Google.com, Twitter.com, Amazon.com are using every day that influence our lives. So a registry is simply an infrastructure provider. They're not much different than an internet service provider. And we can talk about the way that new registries for new top-level domains had special purposes, aspirations to run a .photography, for instance, top-level domain that would be catering to the interests of a particular community. That hasn't worked out to generate much movement in internet governance, nor has it really nudged the needle on the way we experience our online world. So the next slide I wanted to cover was this notion of what is the context where you can be an actor? And I'll use this slide for most of the discussion today. It's a context diagram so that as you select places where you may want to be an actor, you can figure out where to enter and where to be active. Think of it as those same 3 groups we just discussed on the previous slide, right? Businesses, governments, and civil society. And think of them as 3 big super magnets that are arrayed in opposition to each other, pulling on each other. And they're also pulling on the man in the middle, ICANN, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. It's a somewhat misdirected because ICANN has very limited influence on the online conduct and content today. But ICANN was there in the middle early on, 1998. So it became the sun in the sky or the yolk of the egg, if you will, which is why I colored it yellow. And it's what everybody pulls on. But you shouldn't presume that internet governance starts and ends with ICANN. It does not. ICANN is important for the domain name system and a very limited influence on the conduct of those who buy a domain name and simply use the domain name to point to a website or an application to conduct themselves. And ICANN may well be an easy point of entry for some of you to become actors in internet governance. But ICANN has less to do with what we experience online than would businesses, civil society, and the governments who choose to participate at different degrees in ICANN. So let's start at the top and go clockwise around us. Start with governments in blue. I have USA first because the US government, Department of Defense, and universities created the internet protocols, and Dr. Crocker did a fabulous job explaining this to you in one of the earlier sessions. Now, the US government established ICANN in 1998 as an independent coordinator of the DNS, the domain name system, and the numbers, and then gave ICANN its initial structural elements, the supporting organizations, those are SOs, and the ACs, the advisory committees, And I've got them listed in the center of the screen. And we'll spend as much time as you want to understand those different ACs and SOs and groups within ICANN. Now, when the US established ICANN, it did it put the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority contract inside of ICANN, so that IANA is often pronounced as IANA. And that was a tether that the US government had, the US Commerce Department had on ICANN, because operating IANA was truly the way in which ICANN implemented its ability to control the domain name system, because it would therefore publish the root. It would publish the policies and protocols. So in 2013, I had to change this diagram, because prior to that, I had a line between the USA straight down to the IANA function, because the US government held on to that contract. But in 2013, the US government decided to transition the IANA contract entirely within ICANN's hands. And I was a major actor, I think, in the transition period that took a better part of 3 years, as the US government asked ICANN to improve its accountability structure before the US gave up the accountability that it had obtained by holding on to the IANA contract. And for those of you who are students of history, the decision to transition, well, it actually was timed in such a way that many believe it was a reaction to the Edward Snowden revelations. And they played a role in the US government wanting to step back from having active control over internet infrastructure. But at the same time, it was an opportunity for those of us in the community to ensure that ICANN, once untethered from the US government, that ICANN would be accountable to the community it serves. So we spent the better part of 3 years strengthening the accountability of ICANN to its constituents, strengthening the ability of the board to be accountable to the constituents of ICANN, creating multiple levels of bylaws, protections, independent review, and accountability structures, all of which are beginning to be used and are evolving slowly. But again, if we had the most robust accountability structure in the world, and the only thing it held accountable was the entity called ICANN, that would have almost nothing to do with our ability to influence accountability for things like privacy, fraud, crime, and abuse, because ICANN has so little to do with the conduct and content on the domain names that they coordinate with registrars and registries. So your roles may have influence on your governments too. When we have a multinational global audience for the VSIG, and each of you realize that you can testify, lobby, file comments, and you can influence what your governments do. It's even more effective when civil society exerts influence on governments, and business tries as well. Now, I just threw a handful of names of governments in the arc to the right for the simple point of indicating that all governments are in that blue sphere, and all governments participate as actors to the degree they figure it's necessary in organizations like ICANN through the Government Advisory Committee, or GAC, we call it the GAC. They also participate at the United Nations in the General Assembly, but in the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. And that gives them an opportunity to participate in other things that the ITU and the United Nations do, like the Internet Governance Forum. Now, China, for example, not very active at ICANN, somewhat more active in the UN General Assembly and the ITU and the IGF. Infrastructure investments that were prudently made by China in places like Africa and elsewhere. I think they've given China, at this point, a majority of voting power in the General Assembly at the United Nations. That hasn't been used significantly yet, but it could be and would have an opportunity to really change the way the United Nations asserts what degree of influence it wants to have over internet governance. Brazil was a partner with respect to some things that Russia was working on earlier too. Brazil has been very active at ICANN. Though some of you may remember 7 years ago, the Net Mundial conference was hosted by Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2014, and it was done as an effort to step up Brazil's influence over internet governance. Now, Dilma Rousseff ran into some problems and left the stage, but Brazil remains today a major actor in internet governance and very active at ICANN in the Internet Governance Forum. Now, Russia has a more authoritarian government perspective with respect to control of internet speech and internet governance. That is popular with many other governments as well, where government wants to be very strong in its assertion of control over what its people see and say online. So along with India and Brazil, Russia had introduced at several junctures resolutions at the United Nations General Assembly that would have asserted control over the domain name system aspects that are managed by ICANN today. Those have thus far not moved, and it may be because business and civil society and other governments, including my own, the US government, Canadian government, have also pushed back very hard on the idea of having the UN step in and change the way we've structured ICANN today. We call ICANN today a multi-stakeholder model, in the sense that there are multiple stakeholders arrayed on the entirety of this chart who assert their actors and influential role within ICANN. So multiple stakeholders are asked to achieve consensus at the development of policies affecting the domain name system. Again, that's a limited set of policies with respect to what we experience online, but the multi-stakeholder model is meant to live within the ICANN model. Now, the United Nations and the ITU are in the bottom right of this government sliver, and the Internet Governance Forum, or IGF, is an annual gathering sponsored by the United Nations each year. I've been to all of them, and this year Poland is hosting what will end up being a largely virtual session, December 6th through the 10th. If you visit intgovforum.org, you can learn more about not just the IGF global, but the national, regional, sub-regional, and youth-oriented Internet governance forums. I'm one of the founders of the IGF USA. So what that would be is a national Internet governance forum that we do in the summertime. And we take the inputs from that and feed them into the global IGF when it occurs in the autumn, in the later months of the year, because that's an opportunity for us to focus on globally relevant issues. And I can tell you that the IGF itself doesn't spend all that much time talking about things that ICANN controls. The domain name system is not the heart and soul of what is happening online when you look at the emerging and evolving threats and opportunities, things like privacy, artificial intelligence, peer-to-peer technologies, fraud. All of these things are discussed at the IGF, but the IGF, at least thus far, has not taken on the role of issuing policies. It doesn't have agreements and contracts the way ICANN does, so it can't enforce policies. It becomes a place for best practices discussion. An IGF becomes a forum that allows you to discuss emerging problems and try to determine where solutions may emerge. Every once in a while, a solution points to an ICANN role, and therefore ICANN becomes something that everyone focuses on. So let me move to the next sliver, the gray sliver of civil society. So there I'm talking, as I mentioned earlier, universities are major players in places like the generic name support organization at ICANN via the non-commercial stakeholders group, the non-commercial users constituency, and even the nonprofit operating constituency. There was an online question about that in your forum here for VSIG that I saw that was worked out by some of people. So I think what it reveals is that there's fluidity and overlap among the multiple ICANN supporting organizations and advisory committees, SOs and ACs. Within civil society, one of the first places all of you could access as actors is ISOC, the Internet Society. The Public Interest Registry and the sale of .org were also a topic of questions because ISOC itself obtained so much of its funding, basically all of its funding, from the operation of .org. And there was a episode where the sale of the .org had the opportunity of putting $1 billion US into ISOC's coffers. And ICANN was susceptible to a lot of pressure. It came from civil society, business and government, and temporarily at least has blocked that sale. So the ISOC point of entry with the local chapters is an excellent way to go through civil society and an opportunity to influence internet governance if you have your interest there. IETF, much more focused on technology, as the IETF is the Internet Engineering Task Force. It is open to any individual who wants to contribute technical expertise to help make the internet work better. They have no formal memberships. There's no membership fee, and there's nothing for you to sign. If you have technical skills, you may find that that is the place where you should first be an actor in internet governance, is to join the IETF. Recently, in some of the debates at ICANN over the WHOIS policy or registrant information, The IETF came right into the fore because we're going to ask the IETF to examine whether and how to add a field regarding registrant information so that a registrant can indicate whether they are a natural person or are they a legal entity, a legal person, like an organization, corporation, or association. And that distinction ends up being vital to how the Europe's General Data Protection Regime, the GDPR, applies to registrant information publication and disclosure. The regional internet registries are the registries for Internet Protocol or IP numbers. So they're not participating in policies about the top-level domains and domain names, but rather numbers. They're an essential actor. They have less influence on policies because they choose not to be influential on policies. And I believe you do have a course coming up with one of the RIRs. Now, turning finally to the business section, the green section, I'll just roll right up, continuing in a clockwise manner. And the first one to think about is ISPs, the internet service providers that all of us use to gain access to the internet, either as users or as hosts. And those ISPs and hosting service providers, they interact with ICANN. Think of it as this. Every morning, your ISP wakes up and grabs a copy of the root table from ICANN or one of the distributed servers that ICANN has. And that enables your ISP to know that if you're looking for a particular domain name or an email address that ends in, say, .org or .net, they use that root table to figure out who's running .org or who's running .net, so I can go look to determine the IP address of the domain name managing that email or resource that you seek. So there is a small interaction between ISPs and ICANN, and it's a transaction where ICANN hands the root table to the ISPs, and they faithfully use it to deliver domain name resolution to all of us for that day. Moving up, you see hosting providers. That's vital. Anytime those of us put up a website, or perhaps we're using a platform like eBay to sell things, we're going to go to a hosting provider to give us the presence on the internet, to maintain our presence on the internet. And typically they're the ones who manage the IP address and handle the resolution that occurs for people to be able to access our services and sites. They're not regulated in any way by ICANN. They don't have contracts with ICANN, but there is some relationship between hosting providers and registrars who often cooperate or often the same entity. Let me turn next to registrants, and I'll focus on business registrants first because that is where I live in the ICANN business constituency within the generic name support organization at ICANN. And there are multiple interests represented here, but a business who registers a domain name, whether it's in COM or a country code top-level domain, that business registrant has an interest at the availability and the integrity of the domain name system for purposes of allowing people to access their resource and their website. So that availability 24/7, 365 days of the year, 24 hours a day, in every corner of the planet, and really in every script and language, that availability is essential for a business to reach a global audience. So we care deeply about that. We also care about the integrity of the domain name resolution, so that if someone creates a domain name that looks very much like my domain name, and it's intended to deceive people to going there for their traffic, or it's intended to force me to purchase the domain name to avoid consumer confusion. It might even be a direct attempt to infringe on the intellectual property that I have. That when those interests are threatened, the integrity of the domain name system is threatened. And as registrants, we step into ICANN and we use national laws wherever possible, as well as courts, to try to ensure that we can protect our existing and new customers from confusion and fraud if they are misdirected in a malicious way to a domain that isn't at all the domain that I'm offering for them. So there's a consumer protection element here, and the consumer protection advocates include not just the business constituency, but the intellectual property constituency of ICANN and the at-large advisory committee, or ALAC. Those groups have traditionally been very strong for consumer protection and the integrity and availability of domain names. We go inside of ICANN to do work, but by no means is that the only place to go. Local governments are often the object of where we want to exert influence for regulation and enforcement of laws. The European Union, for instance, the European Parliament gave us the General Data Protection Regulation, And that certainly upended a service that ICANN used to run called WHOIS, or it's the registrant information, which is the name and contact info for the one who registered a domain name. That all changed under GDPR, privacy law, but that same European Parliament will be considering in the next several months an update to that. They call it NIS2. It's an update to certain elements of GDPR that may well change the rules affecting the publication and accuracy and disclosure of registrant information, particularly for entities who register domain names where that entity is a legal person, organization, corporation, or association. So you should expect some pursuit of codes of conduct too that are compliant with that. So the intellectual property interests are also working in here, would like to do trusted notifier programs so that they can work more closely with registries. And then domainers are another group that is often not taught about, but domain name traders and speculators are just investors who acquire a domain name that they think may have some real value, some real semantic value to someone in the future. They might put ads on that for the time being, but their ultimate objective may be to develop that domain name with content or to sell that domain name to someone else who finds it to be an attractive way to reach a segment of the planet. That secondary market is huge. The Boston Consulting Group did a study earlier this year, and just looking at .com, which is the largest TLD, .com on a dollar basis, the secondary market is just about as big as the primary market, meaning that the dollars spent by those who are buying domain names from the registries themselves are about as big as the domain names that are purchased from those who bought them earlier, the secondary market. So the primary and secondary markets are nearly equal. And the secondary market itself is nearly double what registries take in from the wholesale prices that they chart, which to some extent are regulated and completely regulated in the .com space. So that's an element, and the domainers themselves have found a home in ICANN. They live in my constituency, the business constituency, since they are a business and they are using the domain name system to run elements of their business. As you roll up to the upper left-hand corner here, we have the contract party house. Contract parties would be registrars, resellers, and registries. And the arrows that connect them to the ICANN center of the circle are the contracts and agreements that enable registrars and registries to do their business with regard to the domain name system. So some, but not all, of the activity of, say, registrars is governed by the ICANN Registrar Accreditation Agreement, or RAA. That enables them to sell domain names. And for instance, the RAA requires that each registrar have a point of contact to accept reports of DNS abuse and respond. DNS abuse currently in ICANN is defined as malware, botnets, phishing, farming, and spam when it serves as a delivery mechanism for other forms of DNS abuse. That's a mouthful, but I think you understand, if you have an interest in the integrity of your online experience, you'd be concerned about DNS abuse. So ICANN has just audited its registrars and found vast majority, they lacked even the ability to report abuse. And that would have been a failure for them to honor a contract obligation. And ICANN is working with registrars to create that abuse contact. And then we'll have to do a subsequent audit to see whether registrars are responding to reports of DNS abuse. Registrars are always reminding us inside of ICANN that they make very small margins on the domain names they sell. So we should expect further consolidation to happen in the registrar industry by players that can provide really valuable services to those of us who register a domain name. That is hosting services, security of our domain name, email communication services, and other kind of value-added elements where the registrar who sells you the domain name is just a point of entry into some valuable services. And then finally, the registries in the upper left-hand corner. A registry itself is an infrastructure company. They're the larger and more established ones, to be sure. Their activity is also under agreements with ICANN. They call it the each of the RYA, registry agreement, are individually negotiated between a registry such as, say, VeriSign or .org with ICANN. And that contains safeguards that they must have. It contains provisions on who may buy domain names in that particular registry. And then registrars are under contract with the registries to execute those policies in selling the domain names and managing them. Now, I would suggest to you that the policy and legal structures that those of you work on the government and civil society side should probably understand that registries and registrars are not really platforms that moderate the content that happens to live on the domain name that they sell or store. It's really a ability to control the domain names themselves, but not the content or conduct on the website itself. So finally, at the center of this, you see ICANN. And ICANN's possibly where you may find your role. Now, ICANN itself is the subject of a course all its own, but ICANN does provide some valuable resources at icann.org/newcomers. I'll let Alfredo put that into the chat. ICANN.org has a community hashtag groups that describes in detail all of the small groups that I have inside of the ICANN center of the sphere. ICANN's policy and development role, however, has some diminishing effect because policy and privacy laws like the GDPR in Europe, they fundamentally changed WHOIS, as I mentioned earlier. And other governments are requiring greater publication, perhaps even in conflict with what Europe has come up with. These kind of conflicting national laws, they take precedent over ICANN policy. ICANN can revoke a contract or find someone in violation of a particular contractual term, but ICANN doesn't put people in jail. ICANN doesn't confiscate property the way a government can when it assesses a fine for violating GDPR or prosecutes someone for violating a national law. So remember, national laws take precedent over what ICANN does. And when national laws conflict with ICANN policy, ICANN has to correct its policy or accommodate it. And when national laws conflict with each other, it's even a stickier problem for ICANN. It may not even really be ICANN's solution to do it. I would say this too is that ICANN is that the new generic top-level domains, the 1,100 different domains, I mentioned dot photography as an earlier example, they haven't had the impact that many expected on innovation, competition, and choice online. The next round of new top-level domains may change all that. And I do hope that the next round of new top-level domains pay more attention to domain names in the individual scripts, the characters, and the languages that are used by the rest of the 7 billion people on this planet who aren't online every day. We want to make sure that the internet is available, as I said earlier, 24/7, 365 in every corner of the planet in every script and language. So the next round of TLDs, I do hope we see a lot more unique scripts and unique languages. The multi-stakeholder model itself is fraying at the edges. And as somebody who's been in it from the beginning, I have to say it's frustrating. And there's a lot of volunteer fatigue inside of the ICANN multi-stakeholder model. Those who, for instance, are unable to achieve consensus or change the status quo, complain about the process itself because they lack perhaps the support and influence necessary to nudge policies in their direction. And that's happened in the .org situation as well. So I would make the point, though, that those of us in the community who wish to exert influence and interest in ICANN, we have to continue to work to support the multi-stakeholder model, even when those who don't get their way criticize the model itself, as opposed to working within the model to generate influence, to build allies, and to gradually be able to nudge policies in the direction they want. If we don't, then we lose perhaps the only multi-stakeholder model that gives us the ability to influence policies outside of appealing to governments themselves. So what is the role for internet users in this picture, end users? The ICANN at-large structure is a natural home. I mentioned ALAC earlier, the ALAC. And diving into the ALAC and an ICANN meeting is rather daunting. So I would strongly recommend you start with the regional at-large organizations. Every corner of this planet is served by a regional at-large organization that enables you at no cost to begin to participate as an end user who's concerned about internet policies. When you think about what's missing from this chart of mine, I realize I don't have criminals and terrorists in here. And for good reason. I wouldn't know how to express their interests and influence anymore than to say this, that the only reason that criminals have not shut down the internet is that they make too much money just allowing it to stay up. So let me turn next to the way that emerging threats and opportunities are there, and then we'll conclude by coming back to this slide with an opportunity for those of you to ask some more questions as well. Maulud, you asked a question about the Chinese proposal at the ITU to replace the TCP/IP protocol. This is the internet. So why don't we expect and embrace innovation? The domain name system, or TCP/IP, may not be the best way or the eventual way that we navigate internet resources. We should expect and embrace innovations. Although I would have thought that innovations would be introduced to the marketplace of ideas and see whether they actually solve problems and create opportunities for people, as opposed to going straight to some governing body and forcing the governing body, asking the governing body to force something new on the rest of the planet. So when someone starts by taking things to the United Nations with an attempt to force it in, I think that's going to really get our attention. And we're going to want to understand, what does it really mean for those of us that want to maintain free expression and free enterprise on the web? We have to be very aware of new protocols, maybe new domain naming and domain access structures that may compromise our ability to have the freedom that we enjoy today. Now, when it comes to emerging threats and opportunities, I promised earlier that we would talk a little bit about this. I don't want to burn too much time on it, but think about it. This will affect all of your interests. It'll affect the roles and the responses of actors in the internet space. Opportunities on the left, you want to think about your interests in them. The peer-to-peer or P2P market has dramatically changed the way so many of us do commerce on the internet today. Think about people selling their labor on things like Lyft and Uber, or programmers on GitHub. Think about assets, those who rent a room in their home or an entire home. Maybe they rent a vehicle or a set of tools on peer-to-peer platforms, asset sharing platforms. And then so many people around the world have been able to make a particular good and reach a global audience by selling that good on an eBay, an Etsy, Pinterest, or an Amazon. So we're seeing an ability for peer-to-peer marketplaces to really empower individuals to make money without having to move to another location. They can use the internet to reach customers around the world. They can use the internet to achieve a degree of autonomy and generate income. We want to preserve that ability. COVID highlighted, for instance, that the e-commerce market is a lot more than just Amazon. Think of all the local restaurants during lockdown, and they survive through delivery services, peer-to-peer delivery services. Small service providers, small hardware stores, they survived on platforms as well. I used Thumbtack, a peer-to-peer platform, to find somebody to do some home repairs when so many of the bigger operations had closed down during COVID. Collaboration is an opportunity too. Shared access to information and co-development. Think about Zoom sessions that you used during COVID to stay connected and productive in your jobs and your communities and remote education. And then community is the sense of community where we can curate user posts and curate content, as in, say, your own Facebook page or Facebook community. The platforms themselves try to cultivate a community that they think suits the brand and aspirations that they have. AI is a little bit mysterious, but it's really just algorithms that are based on reams of data, and therefore they are able to react in real time to changing data. And those algorithms are designed, for instance, in search to deliver the most relevant information and results to you. I know may have implications that you're interested in. You may be interested to know whether an algorithm displaces manual labor that could affect the workforce development. You may be concerned about privacy implications of the data that makes its way into an algorithmic decision, or you may be concerned about the law of competition. If there's a search result that immediately points to somebody's particular mapping tool, is that a competitive concern? And many folks are worried that algorithms based on vast bodies of data may inherently discriminate on rather narrow segments of the population whose data doesn't speak loudly in the algorithms themselves. Okay, watching for questions too. Okay, and then facial recognition really promises to provide great help with security on our own devices, like looking at your phone to unlock it. It can provide physical security at large events and airports. And it will be used, in fact, in the nation of China to enforce the brand new government-mandated limits on screen time for Chinese youths. So facial recognition, like many innovations and opportunities, also creates threats of privacy that all of us are the right to be concerned about. So an actor who's interested in privacy but also likes the innovation of facial recognition has a lot to talk about. It's not going to happen at ICANN. It's It's going to happen in civil society, at business debates, and within government circles. Mobile and 5G promises faster and broader mobile access, which should support more sophisticated apps and a need to get smarter on different opportunities that'll create. With healthcare, we know that the information access and remote care in healthcare during COVID has been remarkable. Now, turning to the right side, we have a whole column of threats. The threats themselves are sometimes related to the innovations and opportunities here. Now, many of you will find your interest and therefore your role as an actor, and you'll find it through the threat side of this slide. And those threats themselves, think about cyber terrorism and ransomware attacks. If you're a company that was a subject of a ransomware attack, maybe one that was enabled by a government actor, that particular entity is going to be very active in any circle it can. That actor is going to go to governments, civil society, and security professionals. It's going to reach out to businesses. It's going to reach out to ICANN and look for ways to reduce that threat, which affects all of us. The DNS itself, the domain name system, is often a target through a distributed denial of service attack. And those are often enabled by prepositioned software bots, malware that is distributed on user computers. I mentioned earlier the crime and fraud, and the DNS itself can be abused with names that are designed to deceive. During COVID, for instance, I was shocked at the number of domain names that were deliberately created to make them seem as if they were official sources of help and information about COVID. Now, not all of those were used for malicious purposes, but some were. And that's an area where ICANN can help to make sure that its contract parties, the registrars, are able to reduce the sale of domain names that are being used for DNS abuse. Privacy is a concern that all of us have, and yet when companies step up to implement technologies to reduce, say, the reliance on third-party cookies for interest-based ads, there's often a constituency who feels harmed by that innovation. Constituencies like advertisers and competitors that push back. I mentioned child exploitation. Apple has recently introduced some innovations to scan the photos that live on a person's device, an Apple, an iPhone, and in order to determine whether they are children's sexual abuse material in those photographs. Well, that immediately has provoked concern by privacy advocates because they're worried about where this would go next. So that's a debate that's happening. And again, that is not happening at ICANN. There's discrimination concerns, but we're always worried about governments who might use the internet technologies to target activists. And of course, anyone who's a parent or teen is concerned about the anxiety that can be created if teens see too many instances and images of their better selves, creating anxiety and concern. And it's recently been a popular topic with respect to social media. Now, with all these emerging threats and opportunities, I would say that the interest and influence of the actors is going to be evolving. I promised you earlier, and then this will be my final slide, is that over the next couple of years, I believe that business loses some of its relative influence, not for lack of trying, but for the fact that civil society and governments are stepping up their game and learning how to be more influential on internet governance themselves. Governments have increased it by asserting brand new laws and regulations like GDPR. Competition authorities have stepped in, and it's a multilateral world where governments themselves don't necessarily check with each other before they head down a certain path of regulation. It creates conflicts of law with any of us that operate on multiple government territory, particularly from the business world, where we have customers in multiple countries. Businesses have to figure a way to handle conflict of law. Now, cooperative relationships with infrastructure companies happens as well, where drug authorities, food and drug authorities may cooperate with registrars and registries in order to be able to take down abuse of domain names if they have investigated the content and conduct there first. But there are serious jurisdictional problems and conflicts of law as well. Civil society has definitely learned to raise its game. Their influence has increased because governments respond to civil society pressure on what the priorities of that government need to be. Think about climate change and privacy. Governmental actions on that, UN action in those areas, is almost entirely driven by a very active civil society, ironically using the very same online tools that businesses provided in order to become more effective as advocates, to be able to organize and deliver content that's compelling. So their increased influence between civil society and government, it comes at the expense of business in a relative way. As they get more influence, as government and civil society acquire more influence, I think it diminishes the relative influence of business community. And in fact, many businesses actually respond themselves to pressure from civil society and citizens. Think about shareholder meetings with respect to climate change or fossil fuels. Think about the way the media has been able to influence the conduct of businesses. Finally, in the lower right-hand corner are users and registrants, the rest of us. We can assert, but we can also resist and object if an advocate is claiming to represent you as they lobby your government, or maybe they lobby ICANN or the United Nations to change a policy. So we shouldn't just presume that everyone in civil society has your interests at heart. The element of influence that occurs is often a function of the volume they achieve, the volume of supporters, and how frequently they're able to repeat that message. But you and I, we have agency. We choose which sites to use. And one of the key choices for you is to think about, where do you want to be an actor in internet governance? So I'll leave this up and take your questions right now, because where do you think you will find your role in internet governance? So with that, I'd love to take some questions, Alfredo. I'll quickly scan the chat to see if we have any in there that I haven't looked at.
So while people gather their thoughts and write some questions they might have, I do have a question for you, Steve. And it's interesting that you talked about the different actors and the influence they may have in internet governance policy development. But I'm wondering, when we are in the civil society and the end user perspective, there are so many organizations speaking in our behalf that sometimes it gets a little bit confusing and the effort gets diluted. What can we do to start talking as one voice instead of different multitudes of speakers?
All right, Alfredo, that's a fantastic question. And I'll use an example. There are civil society advocates for whom privacy is the mantra they follow at all costs. There are other civil society advocates who might see a balance to say that some privacy should be balanced against my consumer protection need. So the whole debate over registrant information and who is came about. So there are citizens whose interests are presumably being represented by elements at ICANN who say that privacy rules, and there are others who address constituencies at ICANN for whom some privacy is worth sacrificing if it helps us to understand who's running a domain that might be attempting to defraud me, stealing intellectual property, or creating DNS abuse. So that balance back and forth is not something that we will resolve in a way that everybody speaks with one voice. In other words, at the end of your question, you asked about one voice. That isn't going to happen. This is an internet where we want to encourage freedom of expression, and we should acknowledge the fact that there may be multiple civil society actors who differ in their priorities. When that happens, you should investigate and then get active as an actor in the civil society groups that most accurately represent your interests. So the ALAC and non-commercial users constituency is a great comparison. The NCUC values privacy over everything. The ALAC has a more balanced view, appreciates privacy, but wants to protect consumers. So my best answer there is to investigate the elements and pick the group of actors who best represents your interests.
And of course, Steve, that doesn't leave out that you can belong to both constituencies or communities and have your voice heard from their perspective in each one of them. Is there any more questions? Joan, I know you're around there in the room. Do you have any questions? Charles, you have a question. Go ahead. Charles, I see you raise your hand, but I'm not seeing your mic.
Steve, it's Joan. Thank you, Alfredo. I was involved with ICANN for a while by accident rather than desire. And one of the things that I observed, because I'm from community, civil society, was I loved the idea and was attracted to the whole idea of the multi-stakeholder model. But what I found was that so many groups um, were in protection mode for their stake. And so that even though that ideas and issues were discussed at each level, that there wasn't a sort of a cross-pollination discussions and agreements. And is there a way to encourage that in the multi-stakeholder model?
Joan, it's a great question. And I remember and I share your frustration that in a multi-stakeholder model where outcomes matter, the stakes are very high. So it's the multi-stakeholders who come together and they're not actually always interested at exchanging views and understanding each other. They're often interested in nudging a policy that's closer to their interests. And that is particularly challenging when the status quo has been established. For 20 years, the status quo at ICANN was a pretty wide open publication of registrant information through WHOIS. When that was the status quo, then privacy interests were very frustrated at the inability to change the status quo because they would have to assemble a large coalition that could generate a consensus or near consensus to make a change. When a government shocks the system the way that Europe did with the GDPR, it flipped the status quo to one that discloses almost no information about registrants. So now everything is flipped, and the community interested in consumer protection, business protection, has got to assemble its own coalition to change the current status quo. I share your view that that process can be very frustrating, and the fact that each party in that multi-stakeholder process sticks to its interests is because there's a lot at stake. They can affect a policy, a contract, and the enforcement of ICANN policies. Now, there are places that we can go and share the views without the pressure of a policy or contract coming out of it. I mentioned earlier the Internet Governance Forum and the regional and local Internet Governance Forums. Since the IGF doesn't actually publish or enforce any policies, the conversation occurs at an easier level. We can actually disagree with each other, agree to disagree, share views, but at the end of the day, it doesn't result in a vote being taken on a new consensus policy. So to the extent one wants to have a lively conversation, it might be that inside of the ICANN MSM that you may be frustrated at your inability to actually get the policy changed. And there are other ways to discuss and share views. And please never shy away from sharing your views with those of us that are still in the beast, fighting those battles in the multi-stakeholder model. And Alfredo, I think that wraps it up to the top of the hour, unless there's any final questions.
Yes, Steve, you are right. It's the top of the hour, and to keep mindful of the time, I wish to thank you, Steve, for the excellent job you have done covering critical topics within the actors module of this course. And if anybody has any more questions, please use the discussion threads in each one of the modules, or you can even contact Steve directly. His email information is within the course, and I know he will gladly answer your questions as well. So again, thank you, Steve, for your excellent presentation. And Steve shared his email in the chat, so it'll be available for you guys as well. So thank you again. And
Say something? May I say
yes,
something?
yes, Joan, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. That was excellent, very informative. And Glenn says to say thank you. And sends his apologies for not being here, but he will touch base with you at a later date.
Thanks to both of you for all you do to help educate everyone in the world on the elements of internet governance, where they can exert their influence in pursuit of their interests. Thank you.
Thank you as well. And this session has ended. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.